American leadership means ending the forever war in Afghanistan.
Hello and welcome to Politics Today. I'm Farrukh Pitafi. Today we are going to talk about something a little bit different. We have been reporting and bringing analysis about Afghanistan and regional changing situation almost daily to you. But this time we are going to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. We are going to talk about the changing world order, whether the world order is changing at all or not. And this forever war in Afghanistan, it has ended in quite an interesting manner. We saw a lot of effort that went in, and it quite visibly was chaotic. So we are going to talk about what becomes of the US power, because in the past we have seen that there have been predictions that the US power is declining and the US allies can no longer rely on the US power, whether it is true or only trick of light. We are going to talk about that, and then what exactly becomes of the world order itself, because when Donald Trump was the president of the US, at that time it was the impression that the liberal world order is on retreat. There were many institutions that were built by that order, like UN and others. So is it really in decline, and is it really going to change? We are going to talk about all these matters and more. In order to help us understand these matters, we are joined on Skype by Zamir Akram Saab, who is a former ambassador, a career diplomat. Zamir Akram Saab, thank you very much, sir, for being part of the program. My second guest who joins me via Skype is Fahad Humayun, who is an analyst, a young budding analyst, a scholar in international affairs, is associated these days with Yale University. Fahad, thank you very much for being part of the program as well. Later in the program, we will be joined by a couple of more guests. I'm going to introduce them the moment they actually join us. But let me start with Ambassador Zamir Akram. Sir, how confident are we that the forever wars are now ending?
Well, I think that the forever war, so-called forever war in Afghanistan is probably over, but that does not mean that the United States would not at some time in the future resort to using what it calls over-the-horizon means to target terrorist groups if they feel they are a threat to the United States. In that sense, I don't think that it's over, because terrorism is still very much prevalent, or terrorists are still very much present in Afghanistan. We have seen ISIS, TTP, and several others. So they are still there, and those kind of elements will and can attract US retaliation or US action. Beyond that, I think at the global level, I don't agree with the assessments that US power has ended. Yes, there are big questions about US credibility and US commitment to its allies, particularly in Europe and Asia. But we must also remember that the US is still a very major power, a military power. Its defense budget is larger than the next 10 countries. So you can imagine how much of money is spent on defense, and these kinds of expenditures explain that the US will continue to be a major world power and a major military power. Then Mr. Biden has also said that he wants to shift the focus away from Afghanistan and look at the larger security or strategic interests that the US has in its confrontation and competition with the Chinese as well as with the Russians. So I think that it is not correct to say that U.S. Interventionism, the U.S. Global role is going to be over as a result of what has happened in Afghanistan.
Right. Ambassador Saab, I'm going to come back to you. Let me bring in Fahad Humayun as well. Fahad Humayun, 20 years ago when the war on terror started, when Afghanistan was invaded, there was a very clear target or goal. And we have seen that the war actually morphed into something else. It became first a regime change war and then nation building war. The initial goals were achieved when Osama bin Laden was killed and Al-Qaeda was smoked out. Now do you think that the US is in a position to learn from its mistakes and we are not going to see further forever wars?
Thank you so much. I think to start with, it's important to sort of, I think, recognize that for the US to learn from its mistakes, it will first have to recognize that mistakes were made in Afghanistan. And I don't think that that recognition exists at the moment. There's very little sense of culpability within Washington about how things have gone south, the speed at which things have unraveled. There also seems to be an attempt to shift the burden of responsibility for events in Afghanistan and the return of the Taliban from the United States and the missteps that have been made over the course of successive American administrations onto other regional players, regional actors, and the Afghan government itself. I agree completely with Ambassador Zamir Akram Saab's assessment that I don't think we're seeing a decline in any way in America's sort of capability in the global order. The United States still remains the net provider of a guarantee of international order in the world. I think what we are seeing is the US very clearly signaling a shift in its priorities. And this isn't a shift that has taken place overnight. We've seen this shift sort of being signaled first from the Obama administration, then the Trump administration, and then the Biden administration, that Afghanistan really wasn't a big priority anymore for the United States.
Right.
So just because
Parth, sorry to cut you. You said that in order to actually reckon with the past, you have to realize their mistakes were made. When you actually train an army, 300,000 strong army, and that army evaporates before your eyes when there is a serious challenge, don't you think that there is already some reckoning about the past?
No, I don't think so, because I think again the conflict in Afghanistan is of course, and the dynamics which unfolded particularly in the last 4 weeks, they are multi-causal. The evisceration and the speed of the evisceration of the Afghan National Defense Security Forces is certainly one of them. But the United States takes the view that the Afghan government under Ashraf Ghani was culpable for the insolvency of the Afghan state insofar as the corruption problem, endemic corruption, was concerned. The fact that the ANDSF hadn't been paid for 3 months, and the ease with which the Taliban was able to wean off defections from the Afghan National Security Forces. So I think policymakers in the United States can still find ways to deflect blame for what went wrong. Even if there is at some level, an awareness of the fact that the entire nation-building project was flawed, deeply flawed to begin with.
Right. Right. That is a very thought-provoking answer. Let me go back to Ambassador Saab. Ambassador Saab, earlier you were saying, and of course Fahad also agreed with what you were saying, that the US is now shifting from nation-building wars or forever wars to a great power rivalry. But with due respect, if it is a matter of containing China and Russia, Afghanistan was a great vantage point. And this is a criticism that has been coming back to haunt Biden administration. How do you reconcile these two things, sir?
Well, I think that Afghanistan certainly is a reversal, or the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the American withdrawal from Afghanistan is certainly is a reversal for America's strategic policy at the global level. And the vacuum that has been created as a result of the American withdrawal is likely to be filled, and is probably going to be filled by the Chinese and the Russians. So to that extent, yes, this is a clear-cut American defeat. However, the point that I made earlier is that the United States still retains enough capability to play a global role. And Fahad's point is valid, that I don't think the American ruling elite, and that I include the politicians, the bureaucracy, the military, the intelligence, and the media, and the American media, they are all on the same page in terms of what went wrong, and the emphasis is to blame somebody else, to blame Pakistan or to blame Ashraf Ghani, but not to really take a full stock of how they mismanaged this whole thing. Some people, yes, some Americans have spoken about that. But the more important thing looking forward is that the Americans still, or the American elite still retain this sanctimonious, messianic view of the United States as a country that is destined, that is bound to promote freedom and democracy and human rights and a free market economy and all those things around the world. And the hard lessons that they have learned in Iraq and Afghanistan, in order to do that through regime change or through nation building and all those kind of efforts which failed, I still don't believe that they have recognized that this is a failed policy, and that perhaps also underscores the kind of competition that they have created with China, for instance, even with Russia. I mean, if you look at which were the countries that instigated this kind of confrontation, it was the United States. And whereas the Chinese and the Russians were looking for a more normal relationship. The problem is that the US believes in a unipolar world which the United States dominates. It has a zero-sum approach. It is not willing to engage in an international system where the Chinese and the Russians are equal partners. This is something totally unacceptable to the American elite.
As we move forward in the program, we are going to talk about the New World Order as well, or whether there is a world order at all now. But let us first keep on focusing on these forever wars. Fahad, for quite some time we kept on hearing that the reason the US was in these two countries, Afghanistan and then Iraq, and eventually Syria also, was to combat terrorism. We remember that during Donald Trump's time, there was a strategic paper which said that terrorism is no longer a concern, and now it is going to be great power rivalry. But with due respect, once again it seems that the US has started talking about terrorism. Do you think that it is going to continue and it is going to be a threat in coming days? You'll have to unmute your mic.
So I think America's exit from Afghanistan doesn't really reduce the terrorist threat that exists or continues to emanate from Afghanistan. I think the actors may have changed on the ground. Yes, to a large extent, Al-Qaeda was the infrastructure that Al-Qaeda enjoyed at the beginning of the 21st century in the form of its networks across the region have been dismantled, in large part thanks to Pakistan's cooperation with the United States. You have to remember many Al-Qaeda leaders were in fact arrested in Pakistan by Pakistani counterterrorism officials, and in coordination and collaboration with the United States. So the irony here is that the last 20 years is also built or predicated in some ways on a enduring counterterrorism cooperation or coordination between Islamabad and Washington. I think the actors on the ground today have changed significantly. We know that the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, is a big threat which has the potential to carry out attacks from Afghanistan into Pakistan. And Daesh, the Islamic State in Khorasan, is another threat which took responsibility for the massacre and carnage at Kabul airport only weeks ago. So these, I think, remain big, blind spots, because these may not be major threats for the United States right now. I think how the United States defines the threat of terrorism is very different to how local actors will define the threat of terrorism. For the United States, it's the ability of terrorists to strike the US homeland or to strike American interests wherever they are. And what we've seen is America has been dialing back on its interest in the region. So in many ways, America is insulating itself from the terrorist blowback that exists in the region. Unfortunately, other countries, Pakistan, China, Russia, we can't insulate ourselves because we don't have the luxury of geography. And I also think that's the key reason why we're going to see greater divergences between Russia and China on the one hand and the United States on the other, given that China and Russia are the great powers that have been left to deal with this mess. So if we see them stepping into this vacuum, I think in many ways the situation has also been abdicated by the United States and forced on other players in the region, because the United States has made it clear it no longer wants to play that role.
Right. Ambassador Saab, same question to you, sir. TTP, Daesh, Khorasan, then ETIM, IMU. There's a long list of organizations that are viewed, at least by some countries, as terror groups. So are we going to hear more about terrorism, or is it this is about it, and now it is going to be confrontation with other countries?
I think there will be both. If you're talking about the United States, they will be concerned about terrorist groups that threaten U.S. interests, either directly the U.S. homeland or U.S. interests abroad, or those of its allies. So to that extent, the U.S. retains the capability of responding, and Mr. Biden, as I said earlier, has identified that he's going to use over-the-horizon means to try and neutralize these kind of terrorist threats. The terrorist threat for Pakistan and China and Russia, Iran, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, all these countries that are close borders, the close borders of Afghanistan, they will continue to face this threat. We know very well the threat from the TTP, from the Baloch movements, the secessionist movements that are based in Afghanistan. ETIM you mentioned, this is a problem for China. Daesh, ISIS is a problem for everyone. So these kind of threats are there, and just because the US has left doesn't mean that these threats are gone. And we also need to remember that the Taliban government is not really in a position to deal with these kind of threats on its own. And so it will need to cooperate with its neighbors, and hopefully that is the way that the regional countries will be working with the Taliban government to address these threats.
Right. Fahad, I understand that you have to leave very quickly. If you want to add something to this discussion about terrorism, especially 20 years ago, it was the impression that Al-Qaeda can repeatedly attack the US on its own soil. Now that threat seems to have abated. But do you think that all these organizations pose no threat to the US at all?
I think there's still a distinct threat that it poses to, as Ambassador Zamir Akram Saab pointed out, to U.S. allies in the region. And I think the U.S. is also capable of, because the U.S. wants to retain some capability within the region to be able to carry out over the horizon counterterrorism operations. I think those operations also have to be, to a certain extent, safeguarded. We know though that in a resolution that the United Nations Security Council attempted to pass, it actually did not mention the names of the ETIM and the Islamic State as predominant threats, which is one of the reasons why Russia and China abstained from endorsing that resolution on Afghanistan. So I think these rifts on the issue of counterterrorism, the extent to which terrorism actually poses a threat to regional countries, will continue to, in many ways, bedevil the regional geopolitical situation.
Right. Thank you very much, Fahad, for this answer. I'm told that we have to take a small break. Fahad Humayun has to leave. He'll leave, but we will be joined by another guest. Ambassador Zamir Akram Saab will continue, and we will talk now about the emerging world order. Let us take a break.
The term American century was coined in 1941 by Henry Luce, who suggested that American internationalism can become something as natural as everyday technology. That ambition saw its fulfillment in the Second World War, the Cold War, and the post-Cold War era. The Americans proudly called themselves the global policemen and the indispensable nation, when their interventions helped small nations such as Bosnia and Kosovo when their European neighbors failed. The American century reached its apex when the Berlin Wall fell and the USSR disintegrated, leaving USA as the sole superpower of the world. But in September 2001, everything changed when a small group of non-state actors struck the US homeland. Thus began the long drawn-out battle across the world to hunt down the terrorists. This battle led the US to Afghanistan, and 20 years later the United States withdrew. The withdrawal left people wondering, is the United States still worthy of being the indispensable nation? China and Russia have risen as formidable competitors to fading US hegemony. It is very important to understand that a new world is taking shape. Western countries are trying to defend their former dominant position, and the Russo-Chinese bloc is forming an aggressive posture. The forever war has finished with a debacle. If this marks the end of American interventionism, what will take its place?
Right. So you were watching a report prepared by and written by our young team. Now I'm joined by another guest in the studio. Dr. Mohammed Shoaib is an assistant professor in IR, and he has written a paper. Actually, his thesis was on China-US rivalry and how the US might actually respond to it. Dr. Shoaib, thank you very much, sir, for being part of the program. And Zamir Akram Saab is continuing from the previous segment. We are going to talk about the new world order. Various people have written various theories. Of course, it started with Fareed Zakaria, who kept on saying the West is declining, the US is declining, and then when it came to theoretical, writers, analysts, they kept on talking about various possibilities. One possibility is that there is going to be a new Cold War between the US and China. And especially given what has happened in Afghanistan of late, there are many people who are actually focusing on that as well. We are going to talk about that. The question right now is whether, as Ambassador Zamir Akram actually pointed out, whether the US power is really declining and whether China really aspires to be a superpower or not, or it is a very different kind of power, and politics perhaps is not the thing that might be actually driving its power. Let me first come to Dr. Shoaib. So your take.
When we look at China and Chinese past, what we understand is that Chinese will not behave like the Americans. They wouldn't really go outside and expand their reach. What Chinese at this moment want is first the security of their own party and then security of their own country. If they are done with these two things and then they are sure that they are secure and the party is secure and the system is secure, then Chinese may like to go outside, but it's too early to really call the Chinese going to be a superpower like the Americans.
When you say then they might go abroad, what do you mean by that? Does it mean exporting their culture, exporting their revolution or something like that? Because we are living in a country where we have been very close to China, and not once did China try to export its revolution, its political system, or for that matter, even culture to Pakistan.
So by that, I actually meant that in the times of Hu Jintao, the Chinese were very reluctant to really go abroad. But what we saw in the recent year, that after Xi Jinping came in China, he came up with an idea that cost China almost $1 trillion.
Right.
And yeah. So if the situation changes in China and new leadership just comes in, we do not really know what kind of decisions it would really bring in China.
Right. But at this moment, I'm glad that you actually brought up Hu Jintao and other leaders as well. But when you look at the overall history, again, there is no precedent of China ever invading another country or expanding its reach beyond its borders. Is there any? 5,000 years.
There are actually some instances. For example, in 1979, the Chinese invaded Vietnam.
Yeah.
But historically, when we see
invaded or supported?
No, it actually invaded Vietnam in 1979, and that's what Americans are confident of, that the Chinese lost fought a war in 1979.
Okay.
And secondly, the Chinese have historically tried to Sinicize the region. I mean, to change the region culturally on the lines of the Chinese Empire, in which the Chinese Empire, or in fact the ruler in the Beijing, is taken as someone important or someone who is right in the middle between the people and the God.
Right.
So Chinese have tried to try to promote their culture instead of their military and
Right.
strategic interest.
Right, and that is quite interesting. Let me go back to Ambassador Zamir Akram. Ambassador Saab, a comparison is being made when the US actually withdrew from Afghanistan. Comparison is being made with Saigon, the way the US actually withdrew at that time. At that time also people kept on saying that it is a huge jolt to the US power, and then it was thought that America is going to decline. But the country that at that time was calling shots, or everybody thought that the USSR was the victor, that crumbled within no time. Now, what exactly is happening right now? Are we heading towards a confrontation between China and the US? Does the Chinese government actually want a confrontation with America?
Okay, first of all, I think that the American withdrawal from Kabul, when compared to their withdrawal from Saigon, was, in my view, at least worse than what happened in Saigon. I don't want to belabor that point. The main issue is about what is the future of US power. And as I said in the previous segment, I don't think that the US is a power that is going to collapse or that it is going to recede into the background. The US is a huge military machine. It has a lot of economic strengths, a lot of human resources, etc. All those things are there. So the US will continue to be a major power. What we have to really determine is that there is going to be a comparative decline in US power. That is the important thing. It's a comparative thing. We should not look at it in absolute terms. So now, as to the question that you have asked, that whether the US is going to go the way that the Soviet Union did, no. The US, as I said, has the capacity to bounce back. However, we must also remember that at the time of the withdrawal from Vietnam, the US was in the middle of a Cold War against the Soviet Union, and that was a time when the Chinese were also in a state of confrontation with the Soviet Union. And so the United States played what is usually called the China card by improving its relations with China and aligning with China to the cost of the Soviet Union. And eventually the Soviets made the mistake of invading Afghanistan, and the rest is history, as you know. This time around, it's a reversed role. The United States is now not in a position to play either China or Russia against the other. In fact, it is confronted with a Sino-Russian alliance or a strategic partnership. So this is a far more difficult environment in which the US will have to operate globally. And so my point is that this is going to be a position where, as long as the US refuses to recognize Russia and China as equal partners, it will continue to be in a state of confrontation with these countries, because there's no going back for either China or Russia.
Right. Ambassador Saab, I understand that the US might be perceiving China as a threat, but does China actually want to pose any serious threat to the American power?
No. Actually, even as was mentioned, Hu Jintao and others, from the time, let's say from 2008, when China became the world's second largest economy, coincided with the time when there was a major economic meltdown in the US and the West in general. And that was brought about by the US and Western economic policies, and the Chinese benefited from that. Since that time, we saw the pivot to Asia and the rebalancing and all the efforts that were being made by the United States to keep the Chinese away from catching up or becoming an equal with the US. Throughout this period, the Chinese kept on talking about a peaceful rise and kept on talking about win-win cooperation. And even today, under Xi Jinping, who is far more assertive than Hu Jintao and other Chinese leaders, he also keeps talking about a managed global partnership with the United States. And he talked about this he talked about it in the World Economic Forum, he talked about it in the Chinese Party Congress. So he has consistently been saying this, but he has also been saying that the greatest threat to Chinese interests is now the United States. So they have drawn a very clear line where Chinese interests are. They are in Tibet, they are in Xinjiang, they are in Hong Kong, they are in Taiwan. There will be no compromise on these issues.
And that is very important. Let me, with your permission, Ambassador Saab, let me come back to the studio. And the question that one has to actually ask right now is, what does peaceful rise mean? Does it mean economic rise? Does it mean political rise? What exactly is the Chinese state's ultimate objective?
So when the Chinese started repeating this mantra again and again in early 2000s, by that actually they wanted to convey to the world that the rise of China would not be like the rise of other great powers. When the power transition resulted in wars. So Chinese really wanted to assure, particularly the Americans, that if even we become an economic superpower, we are not going to disrupt the international system. Now, that was primarily the message behind the
international system being unipolarity?
Not being unipolarity. In fact,
it was a unipolar world at that time. It was called.
But we must see it in terms of liberal international order that was created after World War II.
Right.
So because that order really benefits the Chinese, because it has enabled the Chinese to become number 2, in fact.
Right. When you say number 2, of course, in terms of GDP growth, it must be quite big. But when you look in terms of per capita income, when you look at PPP, there doesn't seem to be that kind of competition. The US is far ahead.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we have to really understand. That's why I am calling the Chinese number 2. Otherwise, most of the people now, they have really calling the Chinese number 1. Now, the Chinese stand at number 2. But actually, there are many other things other than economy. If we look at the weapon system, if we look at the number of papers researchers are publishing, if we look at the number of patents the scientists are getting registered, so Chinese are really catching up the Americans.
Right. Right. But, you know, earlier you brought up Vietnam, and you actually pointed out that there was an invasion. Whether it was an invasion or it was in aid of another country's power, regardless, the fact remains that in the rest of history, you haven't seen any colonizing, approach, or have you?
There have been, actually. That's what I mean.
Give me examples.
For example, when the Chinese were there, actually Korea used to be a Chinese protectorate.
Okay.
So what happens in 16th century and 17th century is that we see the Chinese moving toward the west of China.
Okay.
And later on,
that was China, nevertheless.
That was not actually. At times, parts of Western China, they became autonomous.
Okay.
For example, if we look into early 20th century, Tibet was talking directly to the British Empire. But later on, when the communist China was created in 1949, the Chinese went into Tibet in 1951, and then they had an agreement with the Tibetans in 1950.
Yeah, but regardless, see, that is the interesting part. One power claims to actually have an influence all over the world, and it actually arrogates to itself the role of a policeman. The other power is only talking about its historical claims. I mean, when you talk about Formosa, that has now changed into another very important country. Everybody is talking about that. Regardless of that, you haven't seen any impulse to say colonize Japan, Korea, elsewhere. Not today.
Yeah, Mongols actually wanted to go to Japan, but they could not because of
No,
bad feather.
In the end, it was Manchuria's invasion. I mean, Manchuria was invaded, right?
Yeah, but exactly. But we have seen in the recent years is American superpower.
Right.
And American superpower comes with an American agenda. So when the Chinese superpower comes in, it will come with Chinese agenda and backed by and supported by the Chinese history.
Right.
So the model which Americans bring in and which the Chinese would bring in are going to be different.
Right. But China's Middle Kingdom approach is nothing more than Monroe Doctrine of China. Is that what you're saying?
Almost, yes.
And it is going to change in coming days.
We do not really know what happens with the CCP or what happens within China or what happens with the Chinese politics.
Right.
We do not know how does Xi Jinping government fare after 5 years.
Yeah.
If there is some kind of rebellion against the government.
Has there ever been?
There have actually been in history.
Somebody has been replaced?
There have been. Look at the events what happened after 1989. The General Secretary of Chinese Communist Party was simply sent home, and then he spent all of his life at his home. He couldn't really go out.
Right. I understand that there might be many things that might be happening, but at this moment it seems that the ruling party and the head of government both are very stable, and there doesn't seem to be any serious challenge to them. I'm told that we have to conclude the program. Ambassador Zamir Akram Saab, do you want to come in for a conclusion, sir?
I just want to say that I'm not an expert on China's internal politics, but I want to emphasize the point that for the current Chinese leadership under President Xi, the most important agenda is to restore Chinese pride in their system, in their history, and that is what is driving the Chinese nation today. They don't want, they want to make sure that there is no repeat of the kind of humiliation that China had to suffer during the colonial period when it was being occupied by 4 or 5 different countries. And that is the dark chapter in Chinese history which they want to put back and they want to reassert. I want to use the word reassert,
right,
and not to invade or aggression, but to reassert.
Right, Ambassador Saab, I'm told that we have just run out of time. Thank you very much, Ambassador Zamir Akram Saab, for your valuable time and your input. Dr. Mohammad Shoaib, thank you very much, sir, for being part of the program as well. Viewers, we have listened to our participants. Of course, there are many things that are still unknown. There are many moving parts at this moment. But it seems that the idea of decoupling, because when we talk about Cold War, we talk about the USSR and the competition that went on. At that time, they were very different, two very different affairs. At this moment, it seems that the global economy is deeply entrenched and integrated. It will be quite a big task to actually decouple. I don't know whether it is going to happen. There are challenges like COVID-19 and climate change and umpteen others that might actually ensure that people and countries work together. This was today's program. Thank you very much for watching. Take care.